the like rhyming and like the poetry. Hello everybody, my name is Kelsey and we're about to get very, very nerdy with some required reading that I loved. So when I was doing my most recent non-vlog video, which was where I was just kind of looking back on my favorites when I first started YouTube, I had a lot of things in there that were books that I had from school, which made me think about like the books that were required for reading for classes for summer, things like that, that I just really enjoyed. And I thought it might be kind of fun to talk about them. So I have a very relatively small stack here of books that I've kind of like thought about from middle school all the way up to college that were required for certain classes, summer reading, etc. And I thought we just kind of talk about them and I'll share some of my favorites with you. So they're actually kind of in order from like the youngest I was to like college aged. So without even meaning to, I kind of did put them in order. But let's just dive in, shall we? The first two on this list are going to look very familiar to you because they were in that video. The first one is Fahrenheit 451 by Ray Bradbury. This I read when I was in 8th grade. We had like 3 major books that year, and this was one of them. I wasn't really sure what we were getting into, but I had heard this name before, so I knew it was like a relatively popular book, so I knew we were getting into like some of the books that everyone was required to read. And I ended up really enjoying it. I don't know what it was about the world. Maybe it was the very first like dystopian kind of world that I'd really read before, because I don't think even at that point I'd really gotten into reading some of the like classics for the 2000s. So I didn't have like any like Divergent or anything like that. I hadn't read anything like that before. And so this was like my first real sci-fi dystopian kind of book. It also has to do with reading, which, as y'all know, I clearly love, and so I very much loved back then, and I didn't have a whole lot of people that I knew who loved to read beyond like the people who would just read for class. So it was really cool to have a book about books, which I had never experienced before. I do think this is definitely worth a reread. There's definitely some stuff in here, political themes and stuff, I'm sure I missed, because there are things that like are sticking out in my memory of stuff that was in this book that didn't make sense to me when I was reading it, and now I'm like, I'm sure that would actually make a whole lot of sense. So yeah, I just really adored this one. I don't really know if it was just the story itself, but I definitely got sucked up. I cared for these characters wholeheartedly, and I devoured this book way faster than like the syllabus required you to read it. I just kept going, which will be a theme throughout this video. But yeah, Fahrenheit 451 discovered in 8th grade and loved. The other one that I kind of discovered in 8th grade was To Kill a Mockingbird by Harper Lee. I feel like a lot of people have had to read this book. It's definitely one of those books that is like on everybody's radar. I feel like you can't go through school, at least maybe in the US, you can't go through school without having read something about this or read parts of this. Now, I did know the story of To Kill a Mockingbird before we went into the book. I had watched the movie. My parents really wanted me to watch that one time just to kind of really, we had this summer where we just went through a bunch of classics and this was on the list, and so we read it or we watched it that summer, and so I did kind of have an idea of what this story was going into it, but this was really my first book where I read something about racial inequality and maybe police brutality in a sense, and just like all of that race and the legal system and stuff like that. I just remember really devouring this book as well, going through it very, very quickly. Maybe because I already knew the story going in, I kind of enjoyed it a lot more. Of course, there's a lot more to the book than there is to the movie, but like the general plot is there. And I just remember really enjoying this. I mean, enjoying it, quote unquote enjoying it, because obviously there's a lot of this book that's just not fun, but I plowed through it very, very quickly. And yeah, so this is definitely one of those required readings for class that I adored. So the next book, I don't actually remember when I read it. So I'm having it in between my like high school and my middle school, because it was somewhere in those 2 years and I just don't know which ones they were. This copy looks so sad, by the way, and it is This Mythology book by Edith Hamilton, and it's The Timeless Tales of Gods and Heroes. I think this really spurred my just general love of Greek mythology. This is quite literally a short story of all of, or not short story, but a collection of like all the Greek myths. And it's just like, it's old. Like, this is my father's copy when he was in school. It's very much marked up. It has seen better days, but mythology in a sense of like the original mythology doesn't change a whole lot. So this was one that I don't think I read the entire book from, but we definitely picked and chose some of the things. I think I read some of them in middle school. I know for a fact we read some of them in high school because, spoiler, I also read the Odyssey. That'll be my next book. And they wanted us to kind of understand the mythology behind the Odyssey, so like the gods and goddesses and things of that nature. And so I just remember reading bits and pieces of this book, and that really interested me. And like this origin story kind of sense, I really enjoy those types of things. Not just with like Greek mythology, all mythology and culture. I think origin stories are very interesting because it really shapes it takes the same idea and it like is totally different based on cultures and everything, and I think those are very interesting. But I really enjoy just like general stories like this. It felt very folklorish. It felt very, you know, fairy tale-esque as well. So I think that might be why I really enjoyed Greek mythology, but this is definitely what spurred my enjoyment, and I think it was just a mixture of both middle and high school. I didn't like read this book cover to cover, but I did read a bunch of like different bits in this book. So I still have it, clearly, and it's been through the ringer, but it did its job. It got me to love Greek mythology. And then, like I mentioned, the next book is the Odyssey. Now, this one is a little different, and that is because we're now in 9th grade, and that is because I enjoyed my time in the class when we talked about the Odyssey rather than like actually reading the Odyssey. Because if you've ever like sat down and physically read the Odyssey or the Iliad, it's not easy to get through. The like poetic elements to it are hard to comprehend at times. So I would read chapters of the Odyssey and then I'd have to go spark note what I just read because something was off and I couldn't figure out what I was missing. So I did very much enjoy the Odyssey. I liked the story of Odysseus and like his traveling back home. It was like a journey novel. It was the very first journey novel I ever read. For some reason I liked it. I don't like journey novels, but this one worked for me. And I also had a lot of fun. We had to like do a project in school with this that had to do with like recreating either a moment from the Odyssey or like reimagining it in modern times, and we did that, and it was a group of friends that like from multiple different classes for the same teacher, and we did this, and it was my first like video project. I was very proud of it. But like I have really good memories of that, and so like maybe that's why I like the Odyssey. But it is just that like story of going home after war. And it's very well known. There's a lot of like references to the Odyssey and the Iliad in like modern day culture. So like I really enjoyed my time reading it because like it was a very interesting story, but like the physical reading is rough because it's not the easiest, at least the version we had, it was not the easiest translation to like understand. Alright, also in that 9th grade class, we read 1984 by George Orwell. This was my first official full-on sci-fi book, and I don't know what it was about this book, but it is like a sci-fi, and it's like the whole like big brother and like watching you, and like if I read this now I probably wouldn't enjoy it nearly as much because at the time it was written this was supposed to be like way in the future, and like it's for sure now. Like some of the stuff that happens is for sure like in present day life, but it was the like element of rebelling against, like it is a dystopian in a sense, but like rebelling against the man, and then also like finding love, because there is that aspect to it, and just kind of like being your own person. This is another book that I just got completely sucked into and like could not put it down. There was a lot of books this year, like we read a lot in my 9th grade class, and there are things I definitely didn't like we read David Copperfield. Despised that book. So there was a lot that I didn't like, but this one was one of the very few books that I adored and read through so quickly. Again, another one that I definitely sped past what we were supposed to read because I was so interested in what was going on that I like couldn't wait to do my homework for this because we like kept reading it, and I wanted to know all the things. So yeah, this is definitely worth a reread. I'm a little scared to reread it, I'm not gonna lie, because like again, might hit too close to home, but there's just something about this world and I don't know, maybe it was just like one of the first books that I'd read where like there was that dystopian element to it, and I just really enjoyed that for some reason. So yeah, definitely on this list for sure. And then we skip like 3 grades and go straight to senior in high school. And this is not a surprise, it is Pride and Prejudice. So when I was a senior in the class that we had for like it was like literature and comprehension or something, and there was a list of like 5 books, 4 or 5 books that you could read that summer. You had to read at least one, but you had to read something from that list. And Pride and Prejudice was on that. And so I was hemming and hawing because I wasn't sure any of the books on that list looked good. I didn't really want to read any of them, but I'd heard this name before and I thought I'd give it a try just to see what it's like. It seemed like the best option at this point. And it was halfway through when Darcy proposes to Lizzie. And I all of a sudden went, what is happening? And got completely sucked into the story. To the point of now, as you guys know, Jane Austen is one of my favorite authors. I have all of her books. I am obsessed with all things Regency. And it was because I read this book when I was a senior in high school. And it just like took over my life. Like I read it and then I couldn't stop thinking about it. And so then I went and watched like all the adaptions of this. And then I went and watched all the adaptions of all of her books. And then like I just went down the rabbit hole with this one. And I cannot put my finger on what it is, but something clicked in that scene with Lizzie and Darcy on like how ridiculous the situation was. And then I just got sucked into the romance of it and like them actually falling for each other and all of that like fun stuff. And I just love everything Regency now. It's just like a time period that I really, really enjoy. And it is the fault of this book for sure. So, yeah. I read this because of school, and like if I hadn't read this one, I almost read Picture of Dorian Gray that year. So I don't know what would have happened if I read Picture of Dorian Gray. Then maybe I wouldn't be as obsessed with Jane Austen as I am now. Maybe I would have never read a Jane Austen book. Well, that's a sad existence. All right, and then moving way, way up to college. When I think I was a junior, senior in college, I took a Christian lit class. And it was basically like a bunch of novels and books, both I think nonfiction and fiction, and like how they relate back to Christianity. And so there were 3 from that class that really stuck out to me. And one of those is Wonder by R.J. Palacio. This is such a cute book. I think everyone needs to read this at this point, because it's just this very wholesome middle grade book. So this is all about just loving your neighbor, basically, because we follow this kid Augie who's going to school for the very first time. He's been homeschooled his entire life, and he's going, I believe it is middle school. So he starts middle school, but he's been homeschooled because he does have some sort of like physical difference on his face, and his parents have always been very nervous about sending him to public school, but he really wants to go. And so of course we deal with the fact that he looks different from everybody else, bullies, all of that kind of stuff. And, how can you be a kind person when all this stuff is happening to you? I loved the way this was written. It was one of the first books where I really noticed how it was written, because there are many, many different chapters in this book, but there's also many, many different points of view. So you've got young kids like Augie, and then you've got his sister who's in high school, you've got some of the adults, and based on whose point of view you're in, the writing switches, because obviously Augie's going to have very small, short sentences. He's younger. He may not know grammar as well as like his sister in high school, and hers are going to be, if I remember correctly, she had no capital letters in any of her writings. They were all like longer sentences, but none of them have capitalizations. And then of course, once you get to the adults in this book, they have like full on like proper grammar sentences. But it was just very interesting because I'd never really noticed the switch and way things were written for multiple points of view before, and you really notice it in this one. Also, this is just a really sweet book. It's about Augie. He's like the sweetest human being ever. I adore this book. I think it is so, so worth all the hype. It did have a movie that came out recently, which I haven't seen yet. I just adored this so, so much, and I think it's a story that regardless of like who you are, is worth reading, because it's all about kindness, and like that's just like warms my heart. But yeah, this is one of the books that we read in that class, and I just devoured it in like a day. It did not take me long. Another one that I really enjoyed from that class was The Shack, and this is by William Paul Young. This copy has seen better days, as I'm sure you can see. So this is a fiction book that has been turned into a movie as well, which does, I think, have a very good adaptation. And it's basically this guy who goes to a shack. He's like struggling with his religion. It's about like him and like his daughter goes missing and they're trying to figure out what's going on, so he ends up being invited to this shack, and he spends a like, I think it's a weekend with like the three entities of like the Trinity. So you have God, Jesus, and like the Holy Spirit. And so it was really interesting because first off, all of these characters are not what you expect. Like their physical everything about them is like totally different than what you would think. But also there's a lot of conversation in here about like religion specifically, and then grief and everything wrapped up within that. And there's a lot in this book that aligns with my beliefs specifically, and I never read anything that aligned so perfectly with what I thought before, and it was the first time I'd seen something like that. Now of course I've seen it a few times, and like there are definitely things out there, but I mean, take religion out of the equation, it's just an interesting story about a guy who's dealing with grief, and he's dealing with it in very different ways, and I just thought it was beautiful. And again, there was just some bits of this that like I related to so much that I'd never seen before, and like that really clicked with me, so I really enjoyed that book. And then the very last book that I wanted to talk about is Accidental Saints. And this is by Nadia Bolz-Weber, who is a pastor in Colorado, maybe? Yeah, Colorado, look at me. So this is I don't want to say memoir, but like a collection of stories by a pastor in Colorado. She has this, her like church is called House for All Sinners and Saints, and she is very into like being you and like meeting you where you're at. So this is literally a bunch of short stories from her life, literally called Accidental Saints, and like she just has a very fantastic way of writing. It's so relatable, like to the point of like I read this for class and then I immediately went out and like found her biography because like I wanted to know more about her as a person. And so it's really just about like finding the happiness and the joy and like positivity in life, but in all the places you never expected. So it was really just heartwarming reading this book and like all these short stories, and so it's really easy to get through because it's a bunch of short stories. Oh, I forgot I got it signed. Oh man. So it's a lot of like short stories. I think there's about 20 stories in here, and it's all like little things from her life or experiences that she's had or stories that have been told to her of people that she's met, and it's just like finding those happinesses and those positive moments and like places you would never expect to see them in. So it's just like it's really about like the little things in life. That's what I think of when I like think about this book. But I definitely read that for this class, and I love this author. I think she's great. And that's it. Those are just a handful of the books that I have read for one class or the other and really enjoyed. I just thought this would be like a fun little video for like August, which is the beginning of school. I mean, I know that it's the end of August, so everyone's back in school now, at least in the US. So maybe not the start of school, but like, that time for required reading, which, isn't always everyone's favorite. Sometimes there are some real duds on lists, but every once in a while you do get a good book that clicks with you, and so I just wanted to talk about some of the ones that really clicked with me. So I hope that you guys enjoyed this video. Please let me know down below if you've read any of the books that I mentioned, or if there's a book that you read for school that really meant a lot to you, sticks out in your memory for one reason or the other. I would love to know that. But if you like this video, and I very much hope that you did, don't forget to give it a big thumbs up and subscribe down below if you'd like to be part of this awesome growing family. I've also got all my social media down there as well as other fun bookish links, so don't forget to check all that out, and I will see you guys in my next video.